So picture this. You're in a conversation, maybe a debate about, right and wrong.
Right.
Things are getting a little bit tense. And then suddenly the other person just pulls the ultimate ripcord.
Oh, I know exactly where you're going with this.
Yeah. They drop the two most famous words in the English language for shutting down a critique. Judge not.
It is the ultimate conversation ender. I mean, people treat it like this philosophical get-out-of-jail-free card.
Exactly.
The implication is always that just holding any kind of standard is inherently judgmental. And being judgmental is, the cardinal sin of modern society.
It really is. So today we're taking a deep dive into an audio recording of a sermon. It's based on Luke chapter 6, which actually features those exact words from Jesus, "Judge not, and you will not be judged."
Yeah, and the audio we're analyzing today makes a really bold claim. The speaker argues that this might actually be the most misunderstood Bible verse in the entire world.
Because it's just constantly used to promote this live and let live philosophy, right?
Yeah.
The idea that we should just have zero judgment ever.
Right, and when you isolate that one sentence and completely sever it from the rest of the text, it's really easy to see how people arrive at that interpretation.
For sure.
But our mission today is to trace the actual argument being made in Luke 6. The speaker in our source suggests that taking that single verse out of context fractures its meaning so thoroughly.
It just shatters it.
Exactly. It ends up saying the exact opposite of what was actually intended.
Wow.
So to figure out what it actually means to see and judge clearly, we have to follow the chronological story of this idea. And that starts long, long before the first century.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because that live and let live interpretation, it is incredibly tempting.
Oh, absolutely.
It's comfortable. It demands absolutely nothing of you as a listener. Like, you don't bother me, I don't bother you, and we just all go about our day.
It's the path of least resistance.
Right. But just looking at the surrounding text completely dismantles the idea of this universal ban on judgment. If the instruction literally meant never judge anyone ever, it would contradict the rest of Scripture in some pretty wild ways.
Yeah, you really just have to look at the broader context of the New Testament. Jesus himself actually tells his inner circle of disciples that they will eventually sit on 12 thrones.
Right.
And what will they do there? They'll judge the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right. And then St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians that the saints will judge the world. He even throws in this mind-bending detail that believers will actually judge angels.
Which is just a crazy thought.
It is. So a blanket zero-tolerance policy on all judgment, it just doesn't fit the data. The text explicitly expects believers to engage in judgment.
Which forces a very necessary question. If judgment itself isn't universally forbidden, what specific behavior is being condemned in Luke 6?
Right. What's the actual problem?
Well, the speaker in our source identifies it as a very specific phenomenon, blind human judgment. And to understand the mechanics of that blindness, the sermon argues we actually have to examine its origin point in the human story.
Yeah, because right after Jesus says, "Judge not," he asks these two rhetorical questions. He says, "Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit?"
Yeah.
And then he follows that up with this incredibly strange, like almost slapstick image. He asks why you would look at the tiny speck in your brother's eye when you have this massive log sticking out of your own eye.
It really paints a ridiculous picture, right? Like someone just walking around with a giant beam of wood protruding from their face.
Knocking into things.
Exactly. But the source points out that the text isn't just relying on hyperbole for a cheap laugh. The specific word used, the image being evoked, is a piece of wood. It's a tree.
The tree, okay.
The theological argument here is that humanity is suffering from a very specific inherited spiritual condition, tree-induced blindness.
Tree-induced blindness,
Yeah.
which is a direct callback to the Garden of Eden, right?
Yeah.
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yes, exactly. The sermon notes that the narrative of the original sin is entirely about vision and judgment. Adam and Eve weren't just tricked. The text argues they were literally blinded to God's law by the image of that tree.
Oh.
Genesis says they looked at the tree, saw that its fruit was pleasing to the eye, and decided to take it.
Think of it like downloading a corrupted operating system.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, so Adam and Eve looked at the original programming, which was God's definition of right and wrong. And they essentially decided, you know what? We can build a better user interface.
Right. They wanted the admin rights.
Exactly. So once they overwrote that core code and installed their own custom definitions of what was good and what was evil, they put themselves in the seat of the programmer.
Yeah.
And from that moment on, the entire human network got infected with this corrupted code. Every single descendant born into the network that's us was born running a compromised system.
Building on that analogy, the sermon suggests they didn't just alter the code, they changed network administrators entirely.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, by deciding for themselves that God's judgment was wrong and their judgment was right, they made themselves disciples of the blind, rebellious serpent.
Wow.
And there's a principle stated later in Luke 6. A disciple, when fully trained, becomes like their teacher.
So humanity inherited the blindness of its new teacher.
Precisely. The tree, in their eyes, completely obscured true righteousness. The immediate psychological aftermath of eating the fruit was that they couldn't see the world clearly anymore. All they could perceive was their own shame and nakedness.
Man, that reframes the entire judge not command. So when Jesus is looking at the crowds in the first century, he's not just saying don't evaluate anything.
No, not at all.
He's warning them, do not judge blindly. He's saying, do not judge for yourself what is good and evil based on that corrupted operating system you inherited back in the garden. Don't condemn people based on your self-made, subjective definition of right and wrong.
Right. And so if we look for historical examples of this corrupted operating system running at full capacity, the source points directly at the religious elite of the first century, the Pharisees.
The Pharisees, yeah.
They provide the perfect case study of what happens when blind human judgment gets institutionalized.
And to understand the Pharisees' role here, we really have to look at what they were actually doing just before this sermon takes place, because they were aggressively monitoring Jesus and his disciples.
Yeah, context is everything here.
It is.
The Pharisees observed the disciples plucking and eating heads of grain on the Sabbath, right? And then they watched Jesus actively heal a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath.
And their immediate response was to judge and condemn him.
Right. And to understand the mechanics of their judgment, you have to look at the third commandment, the mandate to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Originally, this was a divine gift. It was a required day of rest and reliance on God.
But the Pharisees had completely turned it into a weapon. I mean, in their minds, they were the heroes of the story. They were absolutely convinced they were upholding the strict rule to keep the Sabbath holy.
They really believed they were protecting the divine law. But the sermon points out the reality was much darker. They had completely redefined what honoring the Sabbath meant by layering thousands of their own man-made microscopic rules over the original text.
Just endless rules.
Exactly. They had mapped out exactly how many steps you could take, what kind of knots you could tie, whether you could pluck a single grain of wheat. They effectively replaced God's definition of the Sabbath with their own.
They overwrote the code.
Yeah.
So they condemned Jesus simply because he didn't obey their custom definition of right and wrong. They were operating with that massive tree in their eyes, and they were leading their followers straight into a theological pit.
Yeah. And the speaker in the audio draws a very sharp line from those Pharisees straight into our modern era.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The argument is that the core problem, humanity deciding they get to dictate the terms of reality. Well, it hasn't changed at all.
No, I mean, why would it? We're running the same bad code.
Right. So the sermon highlights two distinct modern manifestations of this tree-induced blindness. And it starts with a broader culture outside the church.
Okay, so from the speaker's perspective, what does that look like? Because the sermon argues that modern secular culture has largely adopted a framework where objective good and evil simply do not exist anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly what it says.
The argument is that we've replaced divine law with a single overriding standard: consent.
Yes, consent.
The cultural logic basically dictates that as long as everyone involved consents of their own free will, any behavior is permissible and perhaps even worthy of celebration.
And the sermon frames this as the ultimate logical endpoint of the Garden of Eden. It's humanity finally filing the paperwork to act as their own gods, which the speaker describes as resulting in gross and obvious displays of sin. But then the text pivots to a second group, and it suggests this group is actually far more dangerous because their blindness is disguised as sight.
Oh, that's insidious. Who is it?
These are the false teachers operating inside the church.
Right. These are the people running the corrupted operating system while wrapping it in a skin that looks exactly like traditional Christianity.
Yes.
They use all the correct biblical vocabulary, but they completely hollow out the definitions.
It's a process of semantic drift. They take these profound, weighty concepts like forgiveness, love, submission, and peace, and they just twist them to mean whatever the modern sinful flesh finds palatable.
I mean, think about how that works in practice. Forgiving others is incredibly easy. if you are the one who gets to define what forgiveness actually entails, and more importantly, who actually qualifies for it.
Oh, absolutely.
Loving your neighbor is a total breeze if you have the power to define the boundaries of what love requires.
Right. And living peaceably with everyone sounds like a really noble pursuit, provided that peace is defined as everyone affirming exactly what you want them to affirm.
Wow.
It's the Pharisee trap reimagined for the 21st century. It's redefining the word of God to suit your own internal desires. The source offers the stark warning that it is incredibly easy to find communities and teachers who will validate your custom definitions of right and wrong.
Yeah, people love to be validated.
They do, but following them is just following another blind guide right into the pit.
Okay, but wait, I got to play devil's advocate here for a second on behalf of anyone listening to this and trying to parse it all out.
Sure.
If the core problem since the dawn of humanity is that we constantly define our own rules, how do we know we aren't doing the exact same thing right now?
That's a fair question.
When we sit here and try to interpret what true forgiveness or true peace actually means based on this sermon, aren't we just using our blind eyes to try and fix our blind eyes? How do we know we aren't just acting as modern Pharisees, utterly convinced we have the right interpretation?
And that right there is the crux of the entire theological framework being presented in the source. The short answer is, if you are relying on your own intellect, your own internal moral compass, you are doing the exact same thing.
Okay.
System from inside the system.
Right.
The sermon is absolute on this point. All mankind, whether they are teachers or disciples, religious or secular, are by nature blind. The only possible mechanism for escape is intervention from outside the system. You need a teacher who doesn't have that original tree blinding their vision.
You need to develop it with uncorrupted code.
Exactly.
Which brings us to Jesus.
Yes. The narrative presents Christ not just as a good moral teacher, but as the only human being who perfectly lived and taught true righteousness.
He was completely uninfected by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Completely. He judged exactly as the Father judged. He loved perfectly according to divine will, and he submitted entirely to that will without ever attempting to redefine the terms to make his own path easier.
And because he operated on completely uncorrupted code, he was violently rejected by a world that could only read the corrupted language.
Yeah.
Much like Adam and Eve rejected God in the garden because they wanted autonomy, the Pharisees rejected Christ because his perfect obedience exposed their artificial righteousness. The tree in their eyes made true righteousness look like a threat that just had to be eliminated.
What's fascinating here is the profound irony in how they chose to eliminate him.
What do you mean?
Well, to execute this perfect teacher, the instrument blind humanity selected was a literal tree. They condemned Christ to death on the wooden beams of the cross.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the sermon highlights a brilliant structural parallel in the text.
Yeah, lay it out.
Think about the physical mechanics of the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve saw the fruit on the tree, and they took it for themselves. That single self-serving action of taking caused the blindness. Now look at the mechanics of what Christ does. He operates in total reversal. He opens your eyes so that you can see clearly, and then instructs you to safely take out the speck from your brother's eye.
The theology here relies on this absolute poetic symmetry. The exact same instrument, the tree that humanity weaponized to condemn Christ, God utilized to forgive humanity.
It's beautiful.
It is a complete structural reversal of the ancient curse. By absorbing the unjust condemnation on the cross, Christ effectively takes the punishment for the original rebellion. Instead of humanity taking for themselves and causing blindness, Christ gives of himself to restore sight, empowering you to actually remove the blinding agent from someone else.
So he goes down into the pit of death, a pit we were all blindly walking toward anyway, and he conquers it. And in doing so, he removes the metaphorical log of that original tree from humanity's eye and replaces it with his own tree.
Which fundamentally alters how you're supposed to walk out your front door and interact with the world today. The core directive of Luke 6 completely shifts. The takeaway isn't a passive, never judge anyone ever. The active instruction is to judge as Christ judges.
So what does this all actually mean for, Tuesday morning when someone cuts you off in traffic or undermines you at work?
Yeah, the practical application.
Exactly. It's like being handed a brand new pair of glasses with the ultimate corrective prescription. The external world hasn't changed one bit. People are still going to throw the exact same chaotic, painful situations at you. Conflict, betrayal, hatred.
Oh yeah, that doesn't go away.
But looking through the lenses of the cross, completely rewires how your brain processes those events.
And to understand how that rewiring happens, the source says you have to look at what those new glasses actually reveal. The cross displays two massive simultaneous truths: the terrifying severity of God's righteous wrath against sin, and the incomprehensible depth of his mercy in suffering that wrath in your place.
Wow.
When you actually absorb that reality, your internal metrics for justice change completely.
Because if you truly believe that your own massive debt has been completely wiped clean by the cross,
Yeah.
the psychological need to violently extract justice from someone who wronged you starts to dissolve.
Yes.
You can genuinely forgive people, not because what they did was okay, but because you are operating from a place of already being forgiven.
And with your vision cleared by the cross, your purpose shifts outward. The speaker notes that Christ secures your eternal inheritance in heaven, which actually frees up your resources on earth.
Oh, that's a cool way to think about it.
Yeah, your time, your money, your specific vocations, whether you're a parent, a mechanic, a CEO, they are no longer tools you have to frantically use to secure your own worth. They become instruments you can freely use to serve your neighbors.
But we should be incredibly clear here. The sermon does not pitch this as some sort of prosperous life hack that makes every day sunshine and rainbows.
Not at all.
It essentially guarantees that living with these new glasses is going to be brutal.
The internal friction alone is immense. The sermon acknowledges that even with your eyes opened, the old corrupted coat, the flesh, it still lingers in the background.
It's still running in the task manager.
Exactly. It still wants to execute blind judgment. It desperately wants to repay evil for evil and hold others to a standard that you yourself failed to meet. The flesh simply cannot comprehend the logic of the cross.
And externally, living this out practically guarantees conflict. If you start operating on uncorrupted code in a world that's entirely run on malware, the system's going to attack you.
Inevitably.
The text reminds you that a disciple is not greater than his teacher. The world, functioning on its blind, tree-induced logic, hated and persecuted Christ. It will inevitably misunderstand and push back against you when you try to imitate him. To the outside observer, your life might look like a series of failures, humiliations, and suffering.
And the source doesn't shy away from the ultimate failure either, death itself. From a worldly perspective, death looks like a total defeat, a permanent separation from everything and everyone you love. But this is exactly why the corrective lenses of the cross are vital. The cross allows you to see through the illusion of worldly defeat.
Because it proves that Christ was glorified through his shame.
Yes, he conquered through his suffering. The cross reveals the objective reality that death is already a defeated enemy. Christ navigated the pit of death specifically to lead his followers safely through it to eternal life.
It completely inverts the metrics of success and failure. You know, looking back at the whole chronological journey we just took, it's fascinating how the narrative fits together.
It really is.
We started in the Garden of Eden, identifying the root cause. A corrupted, tree-induced blindness born from humanity's desire to write its own code.
Right.
We watched that blindness manifest historically in the Pharisees, who were so blinded by their own rules they condemned God himself. Then we saw the ultimate intervention on the cross, where the second tree absorbed the curse of the first. And finally, the audio source brings you, the listener, to the present moment, inviting you to receive Christ's uncorrupted righteousness, to be declared innocent by the only objective judge, and to finally see clearly.
The entire concept of judgment is redeemed in this framework. It ceases to be a weapon of condemnation wielded by the blind to cast others into the pit. It is transformed into a tool of restoration, utilized by those who have had their vision cleared to help guide others back from the edge.
Which brings us full circle to that ultimate conversation ender. Judge not. We learned today that true judgment isn't about ignoring sin. And it certainly isn't about lazily hiding behind a live and let live philosophy just so you don't have to get involved.
No, it's much harder than that.
True judgment is about having the clear, forgiven vision to gently help remove the speck from someone else's eye. And if you really think about the physics of that action, it implies something profoundly difficult. Real love requires us to get close enough to see people's flaws with crystal clarity without condemning them. You cannot remove a speck from someone's eye from across the room.
You have to get close.
So as you go about your week, ask yourself, who in your life are you currently keeping at arm's length? Simply because it's so much easier to blindly judge them from afar than it is to get close enough to actually help them heal.